She began as a dream, a fleet of boats all made to the same specifications, a single class allowing the outcome of races to be determined not by the vessel, but by the skill of the sailor at the helm. Henry David Thoreau wrote of Cape Cod that a man may stand here and put all America behind him. And for almost a century, those who race Wianno seniors have done just that, taking to the waters of Nantucket Sound and harnessing the power of the wind to ride the waves.
I think it's just one of the great delights of life living on Cape Cod, watching them, those seniors race, and also being at the helm of one when you're doing well.
This sounds like a fairy tale, but in my lifetime as a child, every afternoon we had a 25-mile-an-hour sou'wester. It was just like clockwork. It was called the afternoon sou'wester, and it always came in, and the seniors were always out there.
Sleek and sturdy with classic lines and distinctive gaff rigging, this beautiful yet hardy vessel embodies the very spirit of New England and has become a Cape Cod legend. Cape Cod, Massachusetts has always been synonymous with the sea, and in the late 1800s it was common to see trading ships anchored in the small harbors. But as sail gave way to steam, tall masts slowly disappeared from the horizon, and sailing shifted from commercial to competitive. So it was in 1913 that a group of sailing enthusiasts from Wianno and the village of Osterville decided to level the aquatic playing field by building a single class designed specifically for the ever-changing and challenging conditions of Nantucket Sound. The prospective owners had definite thoughts on design. They wanted a racing boat, fast, able, and good-looking. She would have cruising room for two, be of stout construction, and cost $650, a good sum of money at a time when the average salary was little more than $1,000 a year. The idea of a single-class fleet was hardly revolutionary. There were others already in existence, but there was sufficient interest that 13 families committed to building a vessel. They didn't have to look far for a designer. Nestled on the backside of Osterville Village was Crosby's, a venerable boat-building operation with a history dating back to the 1700s. The Crosbys were perhaps most famous for the boat that proudly carried the family name. Designed in 1850 by Horace Crosby, the Crosby catboat had already reached iconic status. A sturdy vessel with the mast nestled to the front of the bow, the catboat was described as fast and nimble, good attributes in a vessel used for fishing. Horace Manley Crosby, who went by his middle name, had inherited the family's love of boat building, and after discussing requirements and ideas for a single-class racer, he set to work. In those days, builders didn't use plans, so relying on his knowledge of the Sound, Crosby made a half model.
They just didn't know how to draw blueprints. They just didn't do it. I mean, and they carved a half model to get the hull shape they wanted, and if they liked it, they used it. If they didn't, they probably threw it in the wood stove and burn her up.
Working from the model, Crosby expanded the lines and details to full dimension, creating a mold around which the first boat was built. Fittingly, the boat was named the Wianno. Crosby's was a busy place during the winter of 1913 as the crew worked on the new fleet, each built by hand, the pieces cut from patterns to ensure they were all the same. The boats were made from oak and cypress, with 600 pounds of iron cast in their keels, a key ingredient in keeping the center of gravity low, enabling her to cut through the waves.
My cousin Brad or my Uncle Max would make up the oak keel and the stem and the stern and centerboard box. And then they'd lift the form up in the air, and move the keel in and drop the form down on it. And then they'd start steaming oak frames.
In the Wianno, the frames are close together, 9 in the midsection, 12 fore, and 10 aft, all made of native white oak, 1.5 inches square. When oak is steamed, it becomes very pliable and can be bent to a desired shape. And using that technique, the Crosby carpenters rushed the hot ribs to the hull where they were forced into the desired curve.
We used to have it right off the furnace. Cook them for an hour and you could tie a knot in them. But you got to be fast. Slow down, they cool down, then they bust. You don't play games while you're doing that. No talking, I had one guy down underneath the boat, one guy halfway. I used to bring him from the box and drive him into the holes and bend them. No talking, boy, just get those clamps on them.
C-clamps were bolted to the mold to make sure they held their shape.
We take most of them off overnight after, on the following day. Leave them on overnight. Maybe leave 4 on after that, because you still need the clamp, you need the clamps to keep on going. Use a couple hundred clamps for a boat.
When the frame was set, the planking process began. Each length of wood was planed by hand, and as the boat took shape, it was rolled onto its hull so the carpenter could apply it from a more comfortable upright position, making sure the fit was as tight as possible. Then the seams were caulked with cotton, making the new hull watertight, and the mold was removed.
I had 2 guys that worked with me, bending the ribs and planking. When we were going, we could plank a boat in 5 days. And that's with nothing messing up, no screw-ups. And you do them in 5 days, and that was pretty damn good.
The hull complete, the new boat was ready for a deck and cabin, and then paint and finish work.
Smoothing up all the wood and staining and varnishing, and then painting the hull, painting the decks, puttying all the seams, doing the spars, varnishing the spars after they were made.
With an overall length of 25 feet and a beam of 8, the Wianno drew only 2.5 feet with her centerboard up and 6 when down, meeting the specifications of the families that the vessel be able to navigate the shallow shoals of the harbors and yet be sturdy enough to cut through the waves of the Sound in a comfortable manner. Above the boat spread 366 square feet of sail, perfect for catching the ample breezes off Cape Cod, and with her mast tilted slightly forward, she appeared to challenge the very wind that powered her. The mast of a Wianno is made from a single piece of Sitka spruce. A man will walk 5 miles making a mast back and forth as the wood takes shape. Standing 24.5 feet high and angled slightly forward, once stepped, she was ready for rigging. The rigging on a Wianno is unique, a throwback to another time and not one found on today's racing boats, but Manly Crosby knew the Sound and felt gaff rigging was the way to go.
Well, it was right after the catboat. The catboats all gaff rigged, and they would carry sail.
Gaff rigging allowed the boats to compete in sometimes harsh conditions, rarely breaking down under heavy wind.
We've got gusty winds out here with a lower sail, and you still got a lot of square footage of sail. It's much better for these waters.
Seeking speed on less windy days, there was experimenting with other systems.
They did one in Marconi rig. With light air, she was good, but in heavy air, the seniors would walk right by her. She wouldn't stand up.
With rigging completed, she stood ready for cruising and ready for battle, beckoning the wind to blow so she could race through the seas. When the summer of 1914 finally arrived, 14 boats were launched from Crosby Yacht Yard and orders came in for more, an indication the fleet and the competition would continue to grow. The dream of single-class racing was now a reality. In that initial summer of racing, 10 boats would gather to race off East Bay, and the one-class design had, to quote a review written in the spring of 1915, thrills in the way of close starts and finishes such as were never known before. Competition was vigorous, and in the early days, as many as half the fleet sailed with professional skippers.
Most of these early people had skippers, and the skippers were local guys who had grown up on the water and were pretty darn good sailors, and the skippers got the boat together, put the sail on, and these days you had cotton sails, you had to put them on, take them off every race.
The owners would appear before race time, some boarding prior to departure, and others, like the Parlett sisters Edna and Mary, ferrying out to their waiting seniors on the shore launch, then gathering their skirts and stepping daintily aboard. During the actual race, the owners took the helm, listening to the advice of their hired hands who offered tactical suggestions as they trimmed the sails. Paid $12 per race, a decent payday in the 1920s, The skippers were fierce competitors.
If you wanted to see the blood flow, once a year there was a skipper's race, and the skippers raced these boats themselves, and there was money on the table for that race, and these guys were very serious, and they were trying to make a reputation.
In 1922, smaller versions of the Wianno were made, sailed by kids, and known as juniors. The originals were now known simply as seniors and were increasingly referred to not by their names, but by their hull numbers, prominently displayed on their sails. As the fleet continued to grow, racing was divided into two divisions: the Champions class, boats manned with professional sailors, and the so-called Consolation class, consisting of amateurs. Windy afternoons were the norm, the very weather the senior had been built for.
The seniors were always out there, and people didn't tend to reef if they didn't really have to, because that wasn't the way you won races. And people broke gaffs. The gaffs were didn't very often break a boom, and almost nobody in those days broke a mast except in a collision. But they broke gaffs. But you'd go down to Uncle Manley in the boatyard, and the next day you'd have another gaff. It was no big deal. He kept a few spares, and he was always able to crank out some.
At the center of racing activity was a large pier that extended into the Sound off Wianno, proudly flying the flag of the yacht club. Racing was very much a spectator sport, and enthusiasts would gather on the pier and watch the seniors as they sailed from the starting point to a southwest buoy, turning to Collier's Ledge, and then toward Craigville Beach before racing for the finish line. Beginning in 1916, the boats also competed in the annual long-distance race, sailing from Wianno to Falmouth Heights. But in 1928, the decision was made to lengthen the challenge and run between the Yacht Club and Edgartown and Martha's Vineyard, the caveat being to pack warm clothes and take proper safety precautions. In 1929, the fortunes of the country spiraled downward. The stock market collapsed, and America found itself in the depths of an economic depression. But the economic hardship that devastated much of the country had little effect on the pace of senior building at Crosby's. 1930 saw 11 new seniors built and launched, a number surpassed only by the original fleet in 1913. By this time, the cost of the boats had risen to $2,200, but perhaps in deference to the economic crisis gripping the country, Crosby's lowered the price to $1,500. 80 Wiannos had already been launched when the first set of plans was drawn up in 1930. Manley Crosby was getting older, and the plans ensured future generations would be able to build them. With a strong fleet, the racing was as competitive as ever. 30 seniors now raced against each other regardless of the weather. In 1932, the Wianno Yacht Club moved to a building on West Bay, and the races now began and ended at the club's new pier. Hoping to further expand competition, in 1935 the Wianno Yacht Club raced against neighboring Hyannisport for the first time. The Wianno Yacht Club and its Commodore John W. Horner was largely responsible for the success of the fleet. They were the driving force behind single-class vessels and developed the rules of racing.
In those days, everybody, including ourselves on the Wianno Senior, or most people, carried a very heavy gent. In our case, it was our chauffeur, who oddly enough was an auto racer before he became our chauffeur, and he would sit on the weather rail, and most of the races had a beat to the weather mark, and then a reach, and then a run home. So what would happen is people would beat up to the weather mark with this heavy guy on the rail because you needed the weight, assuming it was blowing pretty hard. In the afternoons it usually did. And then he would jump over the side when they turned the mark, and the launch would pick him up, and the boats didn't, they didn't need these guys anymore, so because the reach and the run didn't require that. They had plenty of people. What they needed was some dead weight. And so about that time, my father, among other people in other clubs, came to the conclusion that that wasn't just the best way to run a race. And so they made this amazing rule that you had to start and finish with the same number of people.
Racing continued through the late 30s, becoming both a social and competitive activity. But with the beginning of World War II, it was time to tend to more serious business. Racing stopped, and so did boat building. Crosby's was enlisted in the effort to defeat Germany.
The Army took the place over during World War II. They maintained and all the landing craft. They did a lot of practicing with landing craft out here for Normandy, go out on the outer beaches. And wreck them.
After the war, the yacht yard once again buzzed with boat building activity. In 1947, the first post-war senior was launched, followed quickly by 5 more that same year. In order to sustain the longevity of the class, the Wianno Yacht Club developed stringent rules for racers and regulations were introduced. Specifications and equipment were standardized to ensure no boat would have competitive advantage except through the sailing abilities of the captain. In 1949, the Scudder Cup was placed in competition, awarded to the skipper with the highest average combined points in the seasonal regattas on Nantucket Sound. Among the more avid senior sailors was the young senator from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
There's no question in my mind that the fact of his association both with sailing seniors, the competition that he had with that, the knowledge of the sea was absolutely indispensable in saving his life in the Pacific when his ship was sunk out Pacific by the Japanese, and he was able to save directly the 2 men who he dragged to shore, but to save the rest of his crew as well. And I'm absolutely convinced it was those lessons that he learned on the Victoria and racing seniors that made such a big difference.
When JFK became president, he continued to sail number 94 and was said to be happiest at the helm of his boat, slicing through the waters off the family compound. His brother shared his passion for seniors, and Robert Kennedy's wife Ethel was famous for taking her boat Resolute out in windy conditions that forced most sailors to stay on shore. When he designed the senior, Manly Crosby was so convinced the iron in the keel would keep her upright, he promised a reward to anyone who could flip one over.
My grandfather said I'd give $1,000 they could tip one over, and they never have yet. Ethel Kennedy tried, but she didn't.
During the 1960s and 70s, 50 more seniors were built, but the future of the fleet was in doubt. In an era of fiberglass, maintaining the wooden seniors was proving to be a costly commitment.
Most boats have to have 1 to 2 coats of varnish every year, and you probably paint the decks every other year. Some boats, the hulls get painted every year. The bottoms have to be painted every year. The spars varnish. People have to spend a lot of money. And then, at today's labor rates, it's very expensive to take care of a boat.
Expensive, but a worthwhile investment. If racing was the aim of the owner's game, maintaining a senior paid off in competition.
There was a fellow come in, he brought Senior 120. And he didn't know anything about sailing racing, but he got it. Then he got interested. And he had this guy, he got the mast set, and he spent money getting that boat fixed. And he was winning races. So with that, some of the other fellows that weren't spending, they started in spending a little money on their boats and getting them ready. And he was the one that started this all, and his name was Jack Fallon.
Fallon dominated racing in the 60s and 70s, winning the prized Scudder Cup a record 9 times and setting a new standard of dominance unmatched to this day.
He had that terrific love of the sea, the love of the people that sailed, and was an absolute perfectionist in all that he did. He always wanted to say, come on over and see my bilge in my boat. You can scratch a match on it. It'll be enlightened. And of course, meanwhile, little Victoria had about 5 inches of water, and you just knew it was getting heavier and heavier, and you'd be blowing past you on a light day, but it was magic.
Time and tide wait for no man, and in 1972, with age catching up to them, the Crosby brothers decided to sell. The yard was bought by Bill Wood, but his tenure was a short one. And in 1976, Crosby Yacht was bought by Hyannis businessman Dick Egan.
When I purchased the yard, there were 2 unfinished wooden boats, the 2 last wooden seniors that had been built, and it wasn't economically feasible to continue to build a wooden boat.
62 years after they launched the first, Crosby Yacht finished construction of the last wooden senior. While constructed with a pride rarely seen in an age of mass production, the days of building wooden boats was drawing to an end.
We'd already entered the era of fiberglass and other synthetic materials. So as I got to know some of the elders in the Wianno senior fleet, we talked about what are we going to do to keep this fleet alive. We need an infusion of new boats. We can't just keep recycling the old ones. because these boats didn't recycle very often. They stayed in families for generations.
Developing and building a fiberglass version of the Senior would be an expensive proposition. $100,000 would be needed to design and tool up for manufacturing, and the new boats could cost as much as $30,000 each.
One of the important things to remember and recognize, and people who are new to the class sometimes don't appreciate it just because they haven't seen it enough, is the interest and the passion that the owners have for their boats and for the class and the group as a whole.
The goal was perpetuating single-class racing, and in order to do that, the fiberglass boats would have to not only weigh the same as the wooden ones, but conform in every way. If the new boats performed better than the old, the wooden boats would be rendered useless, able to race only among themselves. In the fall of 1984, the Osterville Historical Society agreed to back the building of new fiberglass Seniors, but with one stipulation. The new fiberglass-hulled boats must look exactly the same as the originals, with the same wooden spars and finish.
It's a timeless design. You look at it, you see a boat going through, and you compare it to an old black and white photo, and you say, you know, it has staying power, and there's a reason for that. And so, you know, definitely the design.
The other deciding factor was the founding of the Wianno Senior Class Association, an organization made up of boat owners and a testament to the depth of feeling those who sail her have for preserving a legendary racing boat. In July 1985, the decision was made to move ahead.
The important thing was making the fiberglass boats so they performed about the same as the wooden boats. And we hired an architect from Sparkman and Stevens, and he did a careful job of making sure that the weight of the fiberglass was the same, adding ballast so that it would come out the same.
What they did is they took 7 or 8 wooden boats, some of the better boats in the fleet, and they basically took all the data from those 7 or 8 boats and then averaged it together. They threw out data that was outside of the norm, and they established a baseline. And one of the criteria they established at that time was at 4,100 pounds. And then as the result of that engineering study, they were able to develop the lines for the fiberglass boat. They built the tooling and whatnot, and all the fiberglass boats come off the same set of molds. So they're essentially all the same.
When the finishing touches were put on number 176, Sparkman and Stevens made their final weights and measurements, proclaiming that the new boat had essentially the same shape, weight, and trim and stability as the average of the wooden boats. The real test, though, came that summer of 1986, when the first fiberglass-hulled Seniors competed against the older generation. After 3 weekends of racing in varying conditions, the fiberglass Seniors proved competitive, but not dominating. They were fast, but no faster than the older boats, and true to the intentions of the founding families, the skill of the sailor determined the victor.
The traditionalists like the smell of the wooden boat, the sound of a wooden boat, and to me that's really the only difference between the wood and the glass, is the sound of it. It sails the same, it feels the same, it weighs the same.
In 1989, the Wianno Senior celebrated its 75th anniversary. The entire fleet gathering for the occasion, racing in truly windy conditions. But true to her design, she more than withstood the choppy sound. While most Senior owners spent their summers racing, some opted for cruising.
Obviously, it's somewhat Spartan, but a very nice sea boat.
Dick Taylor logged thousands of miles on his beloved Owl, taking the meticulously maintained Senior as far north as Maine and Nova Scotia.
Really some fine experiences cruising on my boat. It always elicited very favorable comments wherever I went, and people were always interested in the boat, interested in the Crosby family and the Crosby yard, and they just generally liked the lines of the Wianno Senior.
With its complex rigging, the Senior has been described as real sailing, an endeavor that requires complete attention to detail and one in which participants find themselves completely consumed. That love of sailing has been passed down generation to generation, and now the grandchildren of the original owners are learning to sail what are truly becoming family heirlooms.
First time on a boat, I think I was in a basket at 5 months. Since I've sailed on 3 different boats that we've owned as a family, plus I've sailed on a couple other boats at different times too. I started off as a cabin boy for my uncle, Stan Moore, passing beers and pumping because the boat leaked bad.
The Senior Class Association maintained the integrity of the fleet through the end of the 20th century. And with the dawn of the new millennium, it seemed the well-established tradition would sail on well into the 21st. Then, on the night of December 10, 2003, the fleet suffered a devastating loss. Fire swept through the storage sheds of Crosby's, lighting the night sky with flames and consuming 21 seniors, 18 of them irreplaceable wooden ones.
It's overwhelming, devastation, and just watch it go, and helpless feeling. Glad that no one was hurt.
I was devastated. It was my worst nightmare. Fire in a boatyard is always total disaster. And of course it occurred at the most inopportune time of the year in December when the sheds are all full of boats. And one of the first things that I thought about was all those wooden Wianno seniors.
The following morning, the amount of damage was staggering. All that remained of the sheds was charred steel beams. In a matter of minutes, almost a century of sailing history had been destroyed. And 100 years of work. For those who put their heart and soul into building them, the loss of the wooden seniors was a tough one to take.
It hurt for a long time. A glass boat, take 2 cups of chemicals and put them together and you get a boat. You mix it up right. You can replace them any day. First you make a telephone call and get a new one of them. But this is a whole different ballgame with these wooden boats that were lost. No replacing them.
But far from being a winter of discontent, the fire served as a beacon to those who loved the Wianno Senior. The sheds were still burning when boat owners began ordering replacements.
I actually placed the order for our boat about 11:30 that night, and I heard the next morning there were a couple more orders that came in.
We bumped into each other watching the boats disappear, and he said, well, I guess that's it. Order me a fiberglass boat. That was number one. But it happened very quickly. People responded rapidly to saying that's not the end of my racing days.
Crosby's would be a busy place in the spring of 2004. Old wooden seniors suddenly became hot commodities.
We've had the pleasure of restoring 2 of them. One of them basically is a completely brand new boat. And that's an interesting story. The boat was originally commissioned for a father and a son. Bought the boat, found the boat in deplorable condition, and said, hey Greg, can you guys fix it up?
Lisa, my wife, and I went down to Harwich where the boat was, and it was under a tarp. The deck was in horrible shape. There's an inch of snow, crusty snow on top of the boat, and we peeled the tarp back, and the deck the canvas was torn through. It was, it's a boat I grew up spending time on, and really I loved it. And I think that was as much a part of my interest in bringing it back, that it was very much a part of my early sailing experiences. And so to reclaim that, and it was really a privilege to be able to find it, and a lot of fun to be part of bringing it back.
In West Barnstable at Ned Crosby's boatyard, work was underway to restore Senior 150, originally built in 1970 by the very man restoring her.
I didn't think there was any broken ribs in her because she was fair. Usually you can spot them 10 feet away. You see the knuckle. On both sides they didn't show them, because what happened, the planks just kind of pushed away from the area but still held the shape. Christ, when we got it over there, I put 50 ribs in that boat.
The commitment to rebuild the fleet and continue single-class racing was strong, and Shaw Yacht in Thomaston, Maine began turning out fiberglass hulls. The need for speedy construction did not, however, supersede the need for stringent adherence to the requirements set forth in 1986. The integrity of the fleet depended on the new hulls conforming to the exact weight specifications of the Senior Class Association. On Cape Cod, finish work began on the hulls. The new generation of seniors was beginning to take shape. Once again, the Senior Association left nothing to chance. The new boats were weighed to ensure all were the same.
Through the years, it's been sort of an honor system thing, and we still maintain that it's the owner's responsibility, but we want to establish a record for the future. And what we do is we weigh the boats, we weigh the movable ballast, because the movable ballast is what is added to the boat to bring it up to the minimum weight. By recording the weight of the boat and then deducting the ballast, we can get a fixed weight for the boat for the future.
In Yarmouth Bass River Yacht Club, member Bill Lawrence finished his Shaw's Built Senior in his backyard, transferring most of the hardware from his old wooden boat to his new fiberglass one. Then, with the arrival of spring, the new boats were launched. For some of those who lost boats in the fire, it was a bittersweet moment.
I was elated and excited about sailing the new boat, and that was a lot of fun. The things that make the boat special are the experiences you have on them and the memories that go with it.
The name of 193 hearkened to the mirror image of her late wooden sister and sported the old sails for her inaugural voyage. Now was time for the new seniors to make their own history. While there were less boats racing than previous summers, those with new boats eagerly brought them to the starting line.
I was nervous. I had no idea if the boat was going to do well, and it went very well the first race out. You know, we're stepped into the future here, and I think the future is fiberglass for the fleet. I hope there will always be wood boats out there. I think there will be, but you know, in order for our fleet to go forward, I think the fiberglass was the answer.
I don't really feel a lot of difference. Other people tell me they do, but I haven't felt a big difference. It's really fast. I don't know if our wooden boat had gotten a little bit old, or it just didn't feel like it had as much get up and go, but this one is just terrific.
It's often been said that if you wait long enough, what's old becomes new again. And that's true for wooden seniors.
There is some talk and there is some interest in building some wooden Wianno seniors, so we have not ruled that out. Matter of fact, I'm exploring the possibilities of possibly doing it this next year. There are some traditionalists who lost their wooden boats who have purchased fiberglass boats that have said, do a wooden boat and we'll buy one. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that we won't have some wooden ones in the future.
Almost a century after the first seniors were launched, the fleet continues to compete on the waters it was built for.
You go up the coast here, all the way up through Maine, different types of boats that are sort of have similar kind of characteristics, but this boat obviously made for just this kind of sea, this kind of wind, these kinds of currents, and they just are outstanding performers.
And on they sail, a constant in an ever-changing world. So what would Manly Crosby think?
He never would have believed there would have been this many built, and he probably had never heard of fiberglass in his time. So he would have been pretty shocked over that.
He didn't expect the class to last over 10 years when he went the first year. He figured it was going to be a 10-year deal and then they'd go on to something else. But obviously they found it was a good boat, so.
As tragic as the 2003 fire was, it moved the Wianno Senior into the 21st century with a renewed interest. The majority of them were now glass, a single-class fleet with some older wooden sisters, but true to the original promise, they were still able to race neck and neck for the finish line and continued to provide thrills in the way of close starts and finishes as were never known before.